The chain was thick enough to hold a bull. It was wrapped twice around the base of a rotted post, then looped through an iron ring bolted to the animal's neck. Crude and heavy and unmistakably deliberate. The horse stood without moving. Its head was low. Its breathing was slow and shallow, the kind of breathing that comes not from calm, but from exhaustion so deep it has become surrender. Lenora watched it from the road for a long moment before she moved. She hadn't been sleeping anyway. Before we follow her into that darkness, think about this. She didn't know what that horse was. She didn't know who put it there, or why, or what it would cost her to touch it. She only knew it was suffering, and she reached for those chains anyway. Ask yourself, would you have done the same? If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. Hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this one builds to something that will stay with you long after it's over. Now, back to that midnight road. Back to that woman. Back to those chains. West Texas, autumn 1883. The land around Cutter's Bluff had a way of making everything look like it was already dying. The soil ran pale and chalky from September onward, cracked into jagged polygons like a map of a country that didn't exist. The few mesquite trees along the ridges held their shape against the sky like old men holding their breath. Grass came in patches, brown and thin, useful only for proving that something had once tried to grow there. The wind moved through constantly, not the violent kind, but the persistent kind, the kind that wore things down slowly without anyone noticing until the thing was already gone. Lenora Vane had lived in this land for 11 years, and she had made peace with all of it. She was 34 years old, though she could have passed for older in certain lights, not because her face had broken down, but because her eyes held a stillness that most people only reached much later, if ever. Brown eyes, weathered at the corners, set in a face that was angular and serious and not unkind. Her hair she kept braided and pinned most days. A dark rope of it swept back from her forehead, streaked now with a pale thread at the left temple that had arrived the winter after her husband disappeared. The ranch she worked was called Pale Rock, after a limestone shelf that jutted from the hillside behind the main house. It was not a prosperous spread. It had never been. When she and her husband Stellan had first come here from Tennessee, young and earnest and badly underprepared, the land had offered them nothing but the opportunity to prove themselves, and they had done so stubbornly and together, season after season, until the ranch was producing enough to live on, if not enough to grow. Then Stellan was gone. Not dead, not officially, not legally, just gone. One November evening, he had ridden south toward the Trellick Water Company's lower fence line to confront someone about a disputed easement, and he had never come home. His horse had returned alone before dawn. There was no body. There were no witnesses. Sheriff Kane Doss had come out, taken notes in a small book, and told her that men sometimes just left. She had looked at him for a long time without speaking. He had not come back. That had been 2 years ago. She had spent those 2 years doing 3 things: running the ranch, waiting for something that never came, and carrying the weight of one particular night inside her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. Because she had tried to stop him. She had stood in the doorway of the main house as he was saddling up, and she had said, "Don't go tonight." And he had smiled at her in that way he had. The way that men I know, but I have to. And she had watched him ride away into the dark, and she had not physically stopped him. She had not grabbed the bridle. She had not followed. She had believed, as she always had, that he knew the risks better than she did, that his judgment was sound, that he would come home. He hadn't. That was the stone she carried. The ranch itself had grown harder to manage in his absence. 2 of the 4 hands who'd worked under Stellan had left within the year, one by choice, one under pressure from a man named Overton Spade, who was the primary landholding partner in the Trellick Water Company and who had made clear to anyone working the smaller ranches that loyalty to small operators came with a price. The 2 who had stayed, a quiet man named Birch who rarely spoke and a younger man called Pell who was barely 19 and still learning, did what they could, which was most things but not quite enough. The fence lines were in disrepair. The south pasture had lost its water access 6 months ago when a dike was redirected further upstream, an act that was almost certainly legal and almost certainly deliberate. The cattle were thinner. The outbuildings were wearing. Lenora did not complain about any of this. What she did instead was wake before dawn, work through the daylight hours, eat a small meal alone in the evening, and then sit in the chair by the front window for an hour before sleeping. She was not waiting for Stellan, or rather, she had stopped believing he was alive without fully accepting that he was dead, which left her in a suspended middle space that had no name she knew of. She watched the road from that chair. She didn't know why. On the night, everything changed. A Thursday in mid-October, when the moon was 3/4 full and the temperature had dropped sharply after sunset. She couldn't sleep at all. The wind was wrong. Not violent, just wrong, shifting directions every few minutes, restless and searching. The horses in the near corral were uneasy. She'd heard them moving since midnight, that restless shuffling that meant something in the air had unsettled them. She'd checked once already, found nothing, gone back inside. Still couldn't sleep. At 2:30, she pulled on her coat and boots and went outside again. She stood in the yard for a moment, listening. The land was dark and silver in the partial moonlight. The mesquites along the fence were still. The horses in the corral had settled. Then she heard it. A sound she couldn't immediately name. A low metallic drag, rhythmic, slow, coming from the direction of the road. She turned toward it, and that was when she saw the shape at the old salvage post, 150 yards down the lane. A horse, black, or nearly black, standing perfectly still. And the chains. She walked toward it without deciding to. That was the honest truth of it. Her legs simply carried her down the lane while her mind was still considering whether to go. And by the time she was 50 yards away, she could see the animal clearly in the moonlight and understood that whatever calculations she might have made were already irrelevant. It was a stallion. Large, larger than she'd expected from a distance, with a deep chest and legs that were built for endurance rather than speed, the kind of animal that could run all day over hard ground. His coat was black with a faint dark bay undertone that only showed in certain lights. His mane was long and tangled with what looked like several days of accumulated debris, dust, burrs, what might have been dried blood at his throat where the iron collar had rubbed. The chains were 3, one around the ring bolted to the post, looped twice, one wrapped around his neck through the iron collar, and this one made something cold move through her chest, around his left foreleg, connected back to the post at ground level, preventing him from raising that leg fully when he moved. He had been hobbled and chained. She stood at 8 feet and looked at him. He looked back at her. His eyes were dark and large and showed no whites. Not the wild rolling panic she'd have expected from an animal in this state, but something else. Something almost deliberate. He watched her the way an animal watches when it has moved past fear into a kind of judgment, studying, patient, waiting to see what she would do. "All right," she said softly. She moved to the post first, examining the chain connections in the moonlight. The primary lock was a heavy padlock, old iron, the kind she'd seen on livestock pens, and it was not locked. It was simply closed, the shackle seated but unlatched. She stared at that for a moment. Whoever had chained him here hadn't expected him to stand still long enough to make locks necessary, or hadn't cared whether she found him, or hadn't cared whether he got loose. None of those possibilities were comfortable. She opened the padlock and unwound the first chain from the post. The stallion moved, just slightly, a shift of weight toward his right side as the tension on the collar chain released. He still didn't pull away. He stood and watched her. She moved to the collar chain next. It was connected to the iron ring at the back of the collar with a simple hook and loop system, and her hands were steady as she worked it free, even though her heart was not. The iron collar itself she couldn't remove without tools she didn't have with her. It was bolted closed, but the chain came free and she unwound it from his neck and let it fall. He exhaled, a long, deep breath, the kind that releases something held. The leg chain was the last and the most careful work. She crouched at his left foreleg, which meant being within striking range of both front hooves, and she was aware of this without letting herself be paralyzed by it. She worked the chain free from the hoof ring. There was a ring around the lower pastern, another bolt she couldn't remove, and when the chain dropped, the stallion slowly, carefully raised that foreleg and set it back down on the ground, testing it. He stood there for a moment, free of the chains but still wearing the collar and the 2 ankle rings. Then he turned his head and looked at her directly. Not the way animals usually looked at people, that quick, glancing, distracted attention. He looked at her the way a person looks at another person when they are trying to understand something important. She felt the hair on her arms rise. "Come on," she said quietly. She didn't touch his lead, There wasn't one, but she walked back toward the ranch, and he followed. Not at a distance, not hesitantly. He walked at her shoulder like he'd done it before, his footfalls soft in the dusty road, his breathing even and quiet. She put him in the smaller east pasture, the one with the repaired fencing that the cattle didn't use, and closed the gate. She stood at the fence and watched him for a while. He walked the perimeter once, slowly, then stopped near the far corner and lowered his head to the dried grass. She noticed the marks then. On his right flank, partially obscured by dust and the angle of the moonlight, there was a brand, but not a ranch brand. It was too complex for that. Interlocking shapes, almost like a geometric symbol, the kind she'd never seen on any livestock in the territory. And below it, faded but visible, what looked like a second mark. Much older. A different brand entirely. She couldn't read it in this light. She went back inside and lay on her bed without sleeping, and the wind settled down, and somewhere in the east pasture the black stallion stood in the darkness, and she did not yet understand what she had done. By 5 in the morning the sky was gray. By 5:30 it was light enough to see the road, and Lenora was already up, at the window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, watching the pale strip of track that ran south from the ranch gate toward the main Cutter's Bluff Road. She saw the first rider at 6. He came from the south at a walk, and at first she thought it was someone passing through. But he stopped at the gate, sat there, looked at the property. Then he turned his horse sideways, so he was facing the lane broadside, and she understood that he wasn't passing through at all. He was holding position. She kept watching. By 6:15, there were 3 riders at the gate. By 6:30, there were 9, and 2 had moved to the ridge above the east pasture, and she understood with a cold and absolute clarity that they were surrounding the ranch, not approaching it. Taking positions, sealing exits. And the east pasture. The black stallion was in the east pasture. She was already dressed. She'd slept in her clothes, which hadn't been a conscious decision so much as a failure to undress. She checked the Winchester on the rack beside the door, loaded 7 rounds in the tube, and went out onto the porch. Young Pell was crossing the yard from the bunkhouse, his face pale and alarmed. "Miss Lenora, there are riders at the—" "I see them," she said. "There's more on the ridge." "I see those 2. He stopped next to her on the porch. He was 19 and trying very hard to look steady. "What do they want?" "I don't know yet." A man detached from the group at the gate and rode up the lane. He was broad and unhurried on a gray horse, wearing a good coat and a hat that didn't belong to a working cowhand. It belonged to a man who wanted to look like a working cowhand while being something else entirely. He stopped at the porch steps and looked at her without removing his hat. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "You've got a horse that doesn't belong to you." She looked at him steadily. "I found an animal chained to a post on the public road. I brought it onto my property. That animal belongs to Mr. Spade's operation." She didn't say anything. "We'll take it back now, and there won't need to be any further discussion." "What's the animal's name?" she asked. The man blinked. It was a small pause, but she caught it. "Beg pardon. If he's Mr. Spade's horse, what's his name?" A longer pause. "That's not really the point of—" "What does he respond to?" The man's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I'm being courteous here. I don't need to be. You have a horse that belongs to someone else, and we've come to collect him. The simple thing is to let us through to your east pasture and conclude this peaceable." She held the Winchester loosely at her side. Not raised, not aimed, just present. "I'll need documentation," she said. "A bill of sale, a brand registration, something with Mr. Spade's name on it that proves ownership. If you've got that, I'll consider it." Something moved behind the man's eyes. Not anger, something colder. "Assessment. I'll come back," he said. He turned his horse and rode back down the lane without hurrying. The riders at the gate didn't move. The 2 on the ridge didn't move. She was surrounded, with no paperwork, a horse she didn't understand, and the cold and growing certainty that she had stepped into something far larger than a midnight act of mercy. Pell looked at her sidelong. "Miss Lenora, what's going on?" "I don't know yet," she said again. But her voice was quieter this time, because she was starting to suspect that wasn't true. The riders stayed. All morning they stayed. They didn't approach again, didn't shout, didn't fire a shot. They simply held their positions with the patience of men who had been told they could wait as long as it took. There were 11 by mid-morning. She counted from the roof of the main house, using Stellant's old brass telescope, spread in a loose cordon that covered all 4 sides of the property. 2 at the south gate, 3 on the north ridge, 2 more at the creek crossing to the east, 4 spread along the far tree line to the west. Professional, coordinated, patient. Birch came in from the lower pasture around 9, having ridden through the cordon via the creek crossing, where the 2 men there had let him pass without a word. He came to the house with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she'd never seen on him before, a guarded, tight look. "Those men at the creek," he said slowly. "I know the one on the left. Name's Doss Waverly. He rides for Spade's full-time operation, not just his cattle outfit. He's been involved in things." "What kind of things?" Birch was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago, there was a small rancher named Orville out near Red Chalk Creek. Had a dispute with Spade about water rights. His barn burned. A month later, he'd sold out and left the territory. Lenora absorbed this. And Waverly was involved. Nobody proved it. But Waverly was in the area the week before the fire. Birch put his hat back on. "I'm not saying run, Miss Lenora. I'm saying I want you to know what you might be dealing with." She nodded slowly. "That horse," he said. "I saw him this morning from the pasture gate. He's something, isn't he?" "Yes," she said. "He is. That brand on his flank. I've never seen one like it." "Neither have I." She went out alone at midday, just to the east pasture fence. The stallion came to her immediately, crossed the pasture at a quick walk, and stopped at the fence, and she noticed his gait was still slightly compromised, still favoring that left foreleg where the chain had been, but less than this morning. He put his nose through the fence rails, and she let him smell her hand without touching him. She studied the brand on his flank more carefully in the daylight. It was unmistakably intentional. Interlocking circles with a vertical bar through them. Not the crude designs most ranchers used, but something deliberate, almost ceremonial. And beneath it, the older mark she'd glimpsed last night. Faded, deep in the skin, something she could almost read now. Almost. The middle letters were the clearest. An R. A capital V. The outer letters were blurred by years. RV. She stood very still. Stellan's name had been Stellan Vane. His initials, when he'd branded their small working stock, had been SV. But before her, before the ranch, before Texas, he had registered his first horses under the name of his original outfit, the one he'd started in Tennessee at 22, before he sold it and came west. She couldn't remember the name of it now. She'd only heard it mentioned twice. She put her hand flat against the fence rail and breathed slowly. RV. The stallion watched her. From the ridge above, the 2 riders watched them both. They were far enough away that she couldn't read their faces, but she could see that they were absolutely still, not watching idly, but watching in the manner of people who were waiting to see a specific thing happen. She didn't know yet what they were waiting for. At 2 in the afternoon, the broad man in the good coat came back up the lane. This time he had 3 men with him. He stopped at the porch steps again. She was already there. "Mr. Spade would like to speak with you personally," the man said. "He'll come himself this evening. He's a reasonable man, and he'd like to resolve this civilly." "I'm happy to speak with anyone," she said. "My position hasn't changed. I'll need documentation." "Ma'am." "My position hasn't changed," she said again quietly. The man studied her for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, "You don't know what that horse is. I know what I saw when I found him. I know what a chain looks like. I know what a hobble looks like. I know what suffering looks like." Something shifted in the man's expression, something that was almost discomfort. He covered it quickly. "Mr. Spade will come at sunset." He rode back down the lane. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and tried to think clearly about what she knew and what she didn't. What she knew. Overton Spade was the most powerful landowner in Cutter's Bluff territory. He controlled the Trellick Water Company, which controlled water access for most of the small ranches in the county. He had men who worked for him that were not cowboys. He had, according to people who said such things quietly and never in writing, been involved in the disappearance of at least one small operator who had opposed him. What she didn't know, why a horse bearing what might be her dead husband's brand was chained to a post on a public road in the middle of the night. Why, when she had brought that horse to safety, 11 armed men had surrounded her ranch by morning. What the men on the ridge were watching for. And she looked at her hands on the table. Why she felt, for the first time in 2 years, like she was doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. Pell found it, and she almost wished he hadn't. She'd sent him to the north side of the property in the early afternoon to check the water trough while she kept watch from the porch, and he came back at a half run, face flushed, holding something in his right hand. It was a small square of oilskin, folded 3 times, worn at the creases. "Found it caught in the post where the stallion was chained," he said. "Must have been tucked under the chain. I went back to check the lock you'd mentioned, and it was there in the dirt, half buried." She took it from him carefully. The oilskin was old, water-stained at one corner. She unfolded it at the kitchen table with Pell watching from a respectful distance, and inside was a single sheet of paper, thin, handwritten in a small, deliberate script. Not a letter, a list, names, and beside each name, a number and a notation. Some of the notations were dates. Some were coordinates, land survey coordinates, the kind that defined property boundaries. She recognized the format because Stellan had used the same format when he'd surveyed their own boundary lines years ago. She scanned the names slowly. 3 of them she recognized. The first was Orville. Birch had just spoken that name this morning. Red Chalk Creek. Barnfire. Left the territory. The second was a name she'd heard in connection with another mysterious departure. A woman named Vashti who had run a small cattle operation southwest of town and who had sold out quietly 2 winters ago under circumstances no one had explained. The third name made her stop breathing for a moment. It was Stellan Vane. Beside his name, a date, a set of land survey coordinates, and a notation that read, simply, refused. She set the paper down on the table and stared at it. Refused. Whatever the list was, a record of transactions, of negotiations, of something darker, Stellan had been on it. He had been approached with something, had refused it, and had ridden out that November night and not come home. The coordinates beside his name were not for Pale Rock Ranch. She knew Pale Rock's survey marks by memory. These were different. Southeast, toward the Dry Creek Basin she'd always been told was worthless terrain. She folded the oilskin carefully and tucked it inside her shirt. She went to the window. The riders on the ridge were still there. The stallion was visible at the far corner of the east pasture, standing quietly. The sun was dropping toward the southwest, and in the gold late afternoon light, she could see the symbol on his flank, the interlocking circles, with startling clarity. She had seen that symbol before. She was certain of it now. She just couldn't remember where. Overton Spade arrived at sunset with 8 men. He was not what she'd expected, though she'd been careful not to expect too much. He was perhaps 55, compact and well-dressed in the manner of a man who had been rich long enough to make it look effortless. Gray at the temples, clean-shaven, hands that were soft except for the riding calluses at the inside of each index finger. He rode a fine bay mare and sat her well. His 8 men spread out across the front of the property in a practiced formation without being told. He dismounted at the gate and walked up the lane alone. She watched him from the porch. He stopped at the steps and looked up at her with an expression that was practiced in its openness, the face of a man who had learned to look reasonable. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "I appreciate your patience today. This situation has been somewhat more complicated than it needed to be, and I apologize for that." "Mr. Spade," she said. He came up the steps, not with aggression, but without asking, and stood on the porch with her. He was shorter than she'd thought from a distance. His eyes were light, gray-blue, and moved constantly in small ways that didn't match his still face. "I'll be direct with you," he said. "That horse is extremely valuable. He's been missing for several weeks, and his recovery is important to a number of ongoing business matters. I'm prepared to compensate you generously for the time and care you've invested since finding him." "What's his name?" she asked again. A very brief pause. "He doesn't have a formal name. He was a working animal." "What does he respond to?" Spade looked at her carefully. "Mrs. Vane, I wonder if we can dispense with these questions and discuss practical matters. I have one more practical question." There was a chain around his left foreleg that limited his movement. "Who put it there?" "He was being transported. He's difficult to manage." That chain wasn't a transport restraint. That chain had been there long enough to start wearing the skin around the fetlock. She kept her voice level. "So, I'd like to understand what he was being managed from." Spade was quiet for a moment. The light was dropping fast, and his face was harder to read in the dusk. "You're a widow, Mrs. Vane," he said, and his voice had shifted, not to cruelty, but to something careful and pointed. "Running this property alone, with 2 hands. I know the south pasture lost its water access this year. I know the fence lines on the east boundary are in poor condition. I know the cattle you're carrying have lost weight." He paused. "I know the past 2 years have been very hard. She didn't respond. I can resolve every one of those problems, he said. Easily. Water restored, fence materials provided, and a cash payment on top of it. In return, I take the horse and we never speak of this again. Pell had come out of the bunkhouse door and was standing in the yard, watching. Birch was somewhere behind the main house. She could feel them without seeing them. You're offering me a great deal for a horse you say is just a working animal, she said. He has sentimental value. What mark do you use for your brand, Mr. Spade? His eyes moved. One small, quick movement before settling again. I beg your pardon. Your brand. What shape is it? A silence. Just long enough. A double bar over an S. Could you show me a document with that brand registered? A livestock certification, anything official with the county seal? His expression didn't change, but she felt the quality of the silence change around him, a tightening. You're making this unnecessarily difficult, he said quietly. I'm making it exactly as difficult as it needs to be, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The last of the sunset light was behind him, throwing his face into shadow. I'll give you until tomorrow morning, he said. Think carefully about what you're protecting and what you're giving up. He stepped off the porch and walked back down the lane without hurrying. His 8 men fell in around him as he reached the road. They didn't leave. They simply moved, reformed, settled into different positions. Campfire points appeared in the dusk, north, south, east, and west. Long and patient and cold. She went inside. On the table, she unfolded the oilskin again and looked at the coordinates beside her husband's name. And then she found a piece of paper and a pencil and worked out, from memory, where they fell on the map of the county. She was right. The Dry Creek Basin, southeast of town, south of the Trellick main waterway. She'd always been told it was worthless land. She wondered who had told her that. She didn't sleep. She sat in Stellan's chair, the big worn one by the front window, and she laid out everything she knew in her mind the way you lay tools on a workbench, one at a time, examined, placed in relation to the others. The horse, branded with a symbol she almost recognized, bearing a mark beneath it that might be her husband's initials, chained on a public road, not locked, as if someone wanted him to be found, or wanted her to find him. The list, names of small operators, dates beside each, refused beside Stellan's. A record of something, pressure applied, compliance obtained, one name outstanding. Spade's offer, water restored, fence materials, cash. More than a horse would warrant. Far more. What was he paying for? Not the horse. He was paying for her silence. He was paying for the list not to surface. He was paying, she understood now with cold certainty, for the same thing he'd bought from every other name on that list. And the coordinates. The Dry Creek Basin. She rose at 3 in the morning and went to the east pasture. The stallion came to her immediately again, out of the darkness, stopping at the fence. She put her hand against his nose and he let her, and she stood there in the cold October night and tried to work through the moral weight of what was in front of her. If she handed him back, she would receive things she needed desperately. Water, fence materials, possibly enough cash to sustain the ranch through the winter, maybe 2 winters. Pell and Birch would be safer. The ranch would survive, and she would know, and Spade would know she knew, and that knowing would remain between them like an untouched understanding, the kind that quietly poisons everything it touches. If she refused, if she kept holding the fence line, she didn't know what came next. The men were patient now, but patience wasn't a resource that lasted forever. Birch had said what he knew about Waverly. She understood what that meant. The ranch was wood and grass and wire, and fire was a permanent condition of the territory. She could lose everything. And yet, she pressed her forehead against the fence rail and closed her eyes. She thought about the night Stellan had ridden out. She thought about the doorway. She thought about the specific weight of standing still when something needs to be done, the particular gravity of an action, how it accumulates inside a person, layer by layer, until it has a mass all its own. She had let him ride out. She had calculated the risk and decided his judgment was sound, and she had stood in the doorway and watched him go. If he was on that list, if he had refused and ridden out to face those men and not come back, then what she was holding in her hands right now was not a horse. It was the thing he had died protecting. She opened her eyes. The stallion looked at her steadily. I know, she said. He exhaled, that long, quiet breath. She went back inside, and she made a decision, and she felt the weight of the stone in her chest shift, Not gone, not lighter exactly, but different. Not grief pulling her backward anymore. Something else. Something that had direction. At 5 in the morning, she wrote a letter and sent Pell into town with it before sunrise, before the riders at the south gate had fully woken. She addressed it to the county land office. She told Pell, "Ride fast, stay on the high road, don't talk to anyone on the way." He looked at her with his 19-year-old eyes and didn't ask questions. She loaded the Winchester. She loaded the short shotgun that lived under the bed. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and she waited for the sun to come up. The riders on the ridge moved first. She noticed it from the porch just after dawn. A shifting in their configuration, the kind of movement that precedes purpose rather than continuing to wait. 2 of the 4 had repositioned to the east, which put them directly above the pasture where the stallion was. Birch came to the porch quickly. "They're moving. I see it. Miss Lenora, if they decide to come down, then they come down," she said. She walked off the porch and into the yard and stood facing the south gate. The Winchester was in her hands. She was not shaking. She was, strangely, entirely calm. The kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having made a decision so completely that the fear doesn't have purchase anymore. Spade appeared at the gate on foot this time. His 8 men stayed at the road. He came up the lane alone, and behind him, behind all of them, she noticed for the first time a group of riders she hadn't counted before, sitting in the far tree line, still as stones. Perhaps a dozen. Not Spade's men. She didn't know why she was sure of that, but she was. Their horses were different. Their stillness was different. They were watching. Spade stopped 10 feet from her. "I'd like to conclude this morning," he said. "So would I," she said. "You've had time to think." "I have." And she looked at him directly. "I'm going to ask you one thing, and I want you to answer honestly, though I don't expect you will. Did you have anything to do with what happened to my husband?" Spade was absolutely still for a moment. Then something moved in his face, very small, very fast, and was covered. He said, "Your husband left on his own volition." "That's not an answer. Mrs. Vane, that is not an answer to the question I asked." Silence. The morning wind moved across the yard, lifting dust. The riders on the ridge had stopped moving. "Hand me the horse," Spade said quietly. "Everything else disappears. Your water comes back. Your fences get repaired. I don't ask about what you found at the post. You don't ask about things that have nothing to do with you. Everyone moves forward. That horse has my husband's mark on him," she said. "Under your mark. And I have a piece of paper with my husband's name on it. And those coordinates." Spade went very still. "I've sent a letter to the land office," she said. "I told them the coordinates and I asked them to pull the survey records for that basin and tell me who filed on those mineral claims and when. I expect they'll send something back within the week." A beat, then another. Spade's voice was quiet and controlled. "You don't know what you're doing." "I think I do," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His gray-blue eyes didn't blink. Then he turned toward his men at the gate, and she tensed and stopped breathing. And Birch, somewhere behind her, she heard the lever action of his own rifle. And then from the tree line, those other riders came out. Not fast, not with guns drawn. They came at a walk, in a line, and they were masked, cloth pulled up across the lower face. But their horses were marked, each one, with a strip of red cloth tied at the bridle, and there were 14 of them, and they spread out in a line between Spade's men and the lane. One of them raised a hand to her, a calm, acknowledging gesture. Not a greeting, a signal. "We're here." Spade looked at the riders. Then he looked back at her. Something crossed his face that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. It wasn't quite fear, but it was adjacent to it. It was the expression of a man calculating odds and finding them, for the first time, against him. He walked back down the lane. His men pulled back. They didn't leave, they withdrew, which was different. But they withdrew, and the masked riders held the line until they were gone to the tree lines on the far side of the road. The yard was quiet. Birch walked up beside her. "Who are they?" "I don't know yet," she said. One of the masked riders dismounted and came up the lane. He was older than she'd expected, 60s, maybe, with hands that told the full story of a life worked outdoors. He pulled the cloth down from his face as he approached, and she saw a face that was deeply weathered and deeply serious, with the kind of eyes that had watched too many things go wrong and had learned not to flinch. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "you know me. We know about this ranch." We've been watching what's been happening here for some months." He stopped a respectful distance from her on the porch. "My name is Cresswell. We're associates of your husband's." Everything inside her shifted. "Stellan worked with us," Cresswell said carefully. "Not in the way of armed men. He was a documenter. Someone who knew what Spade was doing to the small operators and kept records, and who knew where those records could go to do the most damage to the right people." He paused. "The coordinates on that paper. That basin holds a mineral deposit. Silver-bearing ore. Significant enough to make the water rights in this territory worth a great deal more than anyone has acknowledged publicly. Spade has been quietly buying out the small operators to consolidate the land before filing on those claims. The ones who refused." He stopped. "What happened to the ones who refused?" she asked, and her voice was entirely steady. Cresswell was quiet for a moment. "Some left. Some." He met her eyes directly, and she understood what she saw there, and she held his gaze without looking away, even though something in her chest broke open very quietly. Stellan was the last one with full documentation. When he disappeared, we lost the records we needed to take this to a federal authority. He paused. "That list you found on the oilskin, we didn't plant it. We believe it fell from the stallion's collar ring. It was Stellan's. He kept it on the horse because no one searches a horse." She absorbed this slowly. "The horse," she said. "How long did Spade have him?" "Since not long after Stellan disappeared. He would have destroyed him, but the animal has a particular importance. He was one of the original Grant horses, registered to the founding survey of this county. His bloodline is on the charter documents. Whoever controls the horse controls evidence of the original land assignments. That's why Spade needed him back, and why he couldn't simply kill him outright. It would have required explaining where the animal went. Why was he chained on the road?" Cresswell hesitated. "We moved him. We took him from Spade's holding pen 2 nights ago. We were transporting him to safer ground when we had a complication. We had to leave him temporarily. We didn't intend for you to find him." She looked at him for a long time. "But I did," she said. "Yes," Cresswell said. "You did." She turned and looked at the east pasture. The black stallion was at the near fence, watching her. The iron collar still around his neck, the ankle rings still on his legs. "I'll need a farrier's tools," she said, "to get the hardware off him. We can arrange that. And I'll need someone to explain to me exactly where those coordinates fall, and what Stellan found there, and what it would take to get it in front of a federal land commissioner." Cresswell looked at her with something in his face that she could only call respect. "We can arrange that as well," he said. That night, she sat in Stellan's chair by the window again, and the land was dark and quiet, and the riders were gone from their positions for the first time since dawn, and the east pasture was still. She thought about the stone in her chest. She checked for it out of habit. It was still there. It would probably always be there. But it felt, for the first time in 2 years, like it belonged to something. Like it had been part of a wall being built, and the wall was finally coming together into a shape that made sense. They came back at midnight. She was awake. She'd barely slept in 36 hours, and the particular silence of the hour before midnight had been wrong enough to keep her alert. She heard the first horses before she saw the torchlight, and she was out of the chair and at the door in the same movement. For torches, coming fast from the southwest, across the open ground, bypassing the road entirely. No formation, just speed, and the sound of men who had decided that patience was over. She shouted for Birch and was on the porch with the Winchester before the words had finished leaving her mouth. Spade wasn't with them. Spade would not be with them. That was how this worked. That was how it had always worked. Men like Spade paid men like Waverly and stayed at home with clean hands. She counted 6 riders. For torches, 2 of the riders with coils of rope that could only mean one thing. They weren't coming for the horse. Or rather, they were, but not to take him. They were coming to remove the problem entirely. She fired once into the air. They didn't stop. Of course they didn't. Firing into the air was what you did when you hoped the sound alone would work, and it didn't work on men like this. And she had known that when she fired and done it anyway, because it was the warning she owed before the warning that counted. The first rider reached the east pasture fence at a gallop and started to climb it, and she put a round into the gatepost 6 inches from his hands, and he dropped off the fence and went to the ground. The other riders pulled up. There was shouting, urgent, low, and she was already at the fence corner where the sight lines were clearest, Birch coming across the yard at a run behind her. From the north ridge, torchlight appeared. Then more, south, east, 3 points. The masked riders were back. They came down fast this time. Not at a walk. At a full gallop, red-clothed bridles catching the torchlight. 14 riders coming from 3 directions at once, and the 4 men with the torches looked at them coming and made a calculation that was not difficult and began pulling back. Waverly, she knew him now from Birch's description, the broad-shouldered one on the left, held his position for a moment longer than the others. He looked at her across the fence line, and his expression was not angry but something worse, professional and cold and certain. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He turned and rode after the others. She stood in the cold midnight air with the Winchester and listened to the hoofbeats fade, and the east pasture behind her was quiet, and she turned and the stallion was standing at the near fence looking at her with that same steady, ancient patience. She went to the fence. She put her hand on his nose. He exhaled, long, slow, warm against her cold skin. She stayed there until the masked riders had done a full circuit of the perimeter and come back to the yard gate, and Cresswell dismounted and came to her. "They'll try again," he said. "I know," she said. "Will you hold?" She thought about the stone in her chest. She thought about Stellan on that horse, somewhere, sometime, riding into this same territory and knowing the same things she knew now and deciding the same way she was deciding. "Yes," she said. 3 weeks later, a federal land commissioner arrived in Cutter's Bluff. He came with 2 marshals and a set of documents that had been assembled from several sources. The land office response to Lenora's letter, which had indeed found irregularities in the mineral claim filings. The list from the oilskin, which named enough verified operators and dates to constitute a pattern, and a sworn affidavit from Cresswell's group, which turned out to be a loose coalition of small ranch owners and former operators who had been quietly documenting Spade's consolidation for 2 years. Stellan had been their primary contact in the Pale Rock area. He had been the only one who had held out long enough to build a complete chain of evidence. The commissioner summoned Overton Spade to the county office. Lenora was not present for that meeting. She would not have trusted herself in the same room with him. What she learned afterward, through Cresswell, was that Spade had arrived expecting to manage the situation as he had managed many situations before, and had found instead a federal officer who was not managed. The mineral filings were invalidated on grounds of fraudulent acquisition. 3 of the land transfers, including the properties belonging to Orville and Vashti, were flagged for review. Criminal referrals were made to the territorial court on charges of land fraud and coercive displacement. It was not justice for Stellan. Not completely. There was no body, no direct evidence, no charge that could be made stick for what had happened to him. That hole would remain. But the land he had tried to protect, the coordinated water rights that touched 11 small operators including Pale Rock, was pulled out of Spade's consolidated filing and returned to independent assessment. The water diversion that had cut off Lenora's south pasture was ordered reversed within 30 days. On the morning the reversal order came through, she stood at the south pasture gate and watched the water come back into the creek bed, first a trickle, then a steady flow, running over the pale stones and spreading into the dry grass. She stayed until the cattle had found it. Then she went back to the east pasture. The stallion's collar was off. A farrier from Cresswell's group had removed the hardware 3 days after the confrontation. His ankle rings were off. The rub wounds on his neck and foreleg were healing. He moved across the pasture with the free, ground-eating stride of an animal returning to itself. She opened the east pasture gate. He didn't leave immediately. He came to the gate and stood beside her for a long moment, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, that particular warmth of a large animal at rest. He smelled of grass and dust, and something she couldn't name exactly, something old in particular and unchangeable. She thought about the night she'd found him, the chains, the dark, the choice she hadn't quite consciously made before her legs made it for her. She thought about the doorway 2 years ago and Stellan riding south, and all the ways she'd rearranged that moment in her memory since then, looking for the place where she should have moved differently. She put her hand flat against his neck and let herself feel the weight of it. Not the guilt this time, but the other thing. The thing that came after guilt when you'd finally done the right thing in a moment that mattered. Not absolution, not forgiveness, just the knowledge that when the test came again, you had answered it. She stepped back from the gate. He walked through it slowly, 1 foot at a time, And then he was in the open land beyond the fence, and he stopped and looked back at her once. That same steady gaze, patient and unreadable. And then he moved south into the brush and was gone. November came in cold and quiet, as it always did in West Texas. The work of the ranch continued. The fence lines on the east boundary were repaired with materials that arrived from Cresswell's group without explanation or invoice. The south pasture cattle were back on wait. The two hands, Birch and Pell, stayed on, and Lenora hired a third in October. A woman named Davy who'd run her own small operation outside Cutter's Bluff until her lease had fallen through under Spade's pressure, and who knew cattle and fencing and was not afraid of hard weather. The land office records continued to be reviewed. The territorial court process moved slowly, as such processes always did, and Lenora was under no illusion that it would move quickly or arrive at satisfying conclusions on the schedule she would have preferred. These things took years. They broke apart and reassembled. They produced partial remedies and incomplete verdicts. She had learned enough about how the law worked in this territory to expect nothing clean or final. But the water stayed. That was not nothing. She wrote to Stellan's mother in Tennessee, a letter she had been unable to write for 2 years, blocked by the formlessness of his absence, the absence of a body, the absence of a verdict. She wrote the letter in the kitchen at night, slowly, and she told the truth as carefully as she knew how to tell it, which included the parts she didn't know and couldn't confirm. She said, "I believe your son was trying to protect something worth protecting. I believe that's how he would have wanted to spend himself. I believe I finally understand that." She didn't know if she was right. She was working from inference and probability and the evidence of a horse's brand in moonlight. But she sent the letter. Cresswell visited once more before winter closed the roads. He sat in the kitchen with her and drank coffee and told her what he could about Stellan's work with their group, and she listened carefully and asked the questions she needed to ask, and at the end she thanked him and he left. She sat in Stellan's chair by the window that night. The land was dark and still. The mesquites along the ridge were bare now, their shapes clean against a sky that had gone to deep purple with a scattering of cold stars. The South Pasture Creek was running. She could hear it faintly on windless nights if she was quiet enough. She thought about chains. Not the heavy ones she'd unwound from a horse's neck in the dark, but the other kind. The ones that held things people wanted kept quiet. Secrets had a weight, she understood now, not unlike iron. They could be wrapped around an animal, around a piece of land, around a family's livelihood. They could be wrapped around a person's own understanding of themselves. Stellan had known what he was carrying. He had ridden toward it eyes open. She had stood in the doorway and watched him go, and she would carry that doorway always. But she understood now that the carrying didn't have to be only weight. It could also be direction. It could be the thing that oriented you when the choice came again. When the midnight road was dark and a suffering creature was chained to a post, and your legs had to decide which way to move before your mind finished calculating. Your legs knew. The ranch was quiet. The east pasture was empty now, just dry grass and starlight. But she found she didn't need the horse there to feel what the horse had meant, that unexpected, unreasoned act of mercy that had pulled a buried truth into the light and let it breathe. Some chains don't hold animals. They hold what men need the world to keep forgetting. Sometimes the only thing required to break them is someone willing to reach for the lock in the dark. She pulled the blanket across her shoulders and watched the road until the stars moved and the cold deepened and the night settled into its final quiet hour before dawn. If this story moved you, if Lenora's courage in that midnight pasture touched something in you, let me know in the comments. Tell me what you would have done at that fence. Tell me which moment got to you. And if you're watching from somewhere that has its own midnight roads and its own buried truths, drop your city below. I read every one of them. This channel is built on stories like this one, stories that cost something to tell. If you want more, subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the next story is already coming, and it is every bit as heavy as this one. Like this video if you stayed to the end, and share it with someone who needs to hear about a woman who reached for a lock in the dark and didn't let go. Thank you.